Now let's talk about animation in React. And I really like how this is done because after we put a couple tags wrapped around our components, then it's just a matter of playing with the CSS to get everything up and running. So there's two different kinds of animations that we've got going on. The first one is sort of mounting and unmounting of different components. So when I add Atlantic salmon to my order, it sort of slides itself on in, and then when I remove it from my order, it will slide itself out. That's animating the component did mount and the component will unmount. Those things come in and go out. And then the other one is that just when something changes, we want to be able to animate that up and down. So once I add Atlantic salmon and I add a couple more, you see that it just goes bung, 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 bung. It just keeps on climbing. So that's what we're going to do is we're going to start with the animating it in and animating it out. And then we'll look at the a little bit more complicated one, which is the bung, bung, bung. I don't know what you call that. Bung, bung, bung. Let's call it that. So open up your order.js. And at the very top, we need to import a couple things. We're going to import transition group and CSS transition. And that's going to be coming from the React transition group package. Then we have these two new components called transition group and CSS transition. And let's go down to this unordered list of our order. That's where we're going to be mapping through everything. We're going to put that each on its own line. First thing we're going to do is replace this unordered list with the transition group tag. And then we still want it to be an unordered list at the end of the day. So we're going to give it a component property. And this is if you look at the docs for transition group, this tells it what element at the end of the day to actually render out to the page. So it's an unordered list. Good. Give that a save. And we'll go back to here and make sure that everything is still working. Beautiful. If I add a new one, does it still add? Okay, good. Then we need to take every single LI that we're rendering out and wrap it in that other thing that we imported, the CSS transition tag. So let's go to, again, remember we kicked it off to the separate render order function. And now we have this LI for either not finding it or for finding it. Now this is a bit tricky because we're returning three things here and only these two should be wrapped in CSS transition because null shouldn't be wrapped in a CSS. In fact, it will error out if it is. So let's get it working on this one, and then I'll show you a little trick we can do to not double write the same code. So around here, we're going to make a CSS transition tag, and we're going to wrap that LI. And then the CSS transition takes a number of different properties. First one is class names with an S. That's not a typo. And I'll show you why it needs that in just a second. And we're just going to say order. Second is it also needs a key. So I'll just say key. And third, it needs a timeout, which is an object of how fast do they come in and how fast do they go out. So I'll say enter at 250 milliseconds and exit at 250 milliseconds. Good. So now we have the CSS transition group. Now the weird thing is that we need to also copy it and put it on this one as well. Same with the closing tag. Again, I'll show you a little trick we can do so that we're not duplicating that over and over. We can make a sort of a reusable wrapper component for that. So let's go back to our app and make sure everything is still working. Now, when I add items to my order and remove them, ooh, it's already animating for me, and that's because I've shipped you the CSS. But we're going to delete all the CSS and write it together so I can show you exactly how it works. So what I want you to do is to go back to your application, open up the CSS folder, and inside of that, you're going to see animations.styl. And you see order enter, order exit, count enter, and count exit. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and delete all of that, and we're going to write it together. Now, a couple things before we even get running on writing this CSS. So first of all, I'm using a language called Stylus. And Stylus is exactly the same as Sass. It just has the option of doing it based on indentation rather than using colons and semicolons. However, if you are not totally comfortable with Stylus because it's based on indentation, then make sure that you put in the colons in the curly brackets under all of them. Just write it like regular CSS and not like Stylus, because I know some people can get tripped up on it. This is a tab character, or sorry, this is 2 spaces, not a tab character. And I know in Stylus, if you mix tabs and spaces, it will break. So that's just a personal preference. There's nothing there specifically that you need to use. Second is, how do we actually compile it? So if you're using Stylus or Sass or any of these preprocessors, how do you compile it? And the downside to using Create React App is that you cannot use any sort of custom CSS preprocessor in your Webpack build unless you do something called eject. So what we need to do is open up our package.json, and you're going to see that I have 2 scripts here that will actually run the Stylus compiling outside of our Create React app. The first one just does a single compile of our stylus.style file and compiles it to a style.css. And the second one watches for changes and then we'll recompile them out every single time. So really the only difference is the -w flag, which will watch. So we want to run styles watch. So we're going to go to our terminal and kill the process that we currently have. We can hit Control C, and now we want to run npm run styles : watch. And what that's going to do is it's going to first compile our CSS and then watch for any future changes. So that's pretty neat, because what I can do is open up my animations, delete that, give it a save, and you can see that it will trigger a re-render, said compiled style.css. And then if I were to say like div background red, it will compile a second one, and so on and so on. So that's great, but now what I did is I actually just broke my localhost from running. So how do you run both the styles and our npm start at the same time? Well, that's what this package concurrently does. You could just open up 2 terminal tabs and run npm start for your app and run npm styles watch for that. But it's probably easier just to run this watch one, which will concurrently run 2 things here: npm run start and npm run styles watch. So that's what it does in both ones. So we're going to do that, kill it. I'm going to run npm run watch, and that runs concurrently 2 things. And it's kind of neat. I'll tell you first what is the Webpack output, and second, what is the Stylus output. So if you see console logs anywhere, you see exactly what you're working on. And everything is red. Why? Because I showed you this. I said any div has a background red, which is hilarious. So we don't actually need that. Give it a save, and it's going to regenerate all of the styles for us. Good. So why do we have this animation file anyway? And I'll show you exactly why. So first thing we need to do is go to our order. And remember when we did the CSS transition, we said enter 250 milliseconds. Let's make that like 5,000 milliseconds. That means it's going to be 5 seconds to enter and 5 seconds to leave. Now what I want you to do is just use your regular dev tools to inspect one of these LIs and hit the X on it. See what's happening here? It gives it a class of order exit and order exit active, and it's still there, but after 5 seconds, it actually removes the list item. Same thing when I add maybe, let's see, I'm going to add King Crab. It will automatically add the LI, give it a class of order enter and order enter active, and then after a second, it will, or 5 seconds, it will remove those classes. So what's happening here is it's leaving, and boom, now it's gone. What's happening is it's giving us these sort of states as CSS classes, and then we can go ahead and use those CSS classes to add animation to it. So if we go to our animations here and we say, we've got sort of 2 states. So we have order enter, and then we also have another selector is going to be order exit. So let's just do order enter first. And when it has the order enter, let's just give it a background of red. And then when it has a class of also having a class of order enter active, let's give it a background of yellow, a background of yellow. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm just gonna remove this one. It takes 5 seconds to remove now because we put that 5 seconds on there, and then it will finally unmount it. But as I add it in now, you see how it's yellow immediately, and watch what happens now. If I go to my order enter and I add a transition of 0.5 seconds, or not 0.5 seconds, watch now. I'm gonna go to muscles. And you see over 5 seconds, it's animating, because what's happening is that React gives it a class of order enter immediately. And then like 0.1 milliseconds later, it's giving it a class of order enter active. And because these two things are done at a different time, then we can then transition all of the properties from its starting state to its finished state, which in this case is just changing the background. And it's going to transition those properties over 5 seconds. So that's great. And what we can do with that is we can put a transform on it of a translate x negative 120%. And then when it is active, we can give it a transform translate x of 0. So it's going to go from all the way off to the left to all the way where it should be. Let's see here. Move these suckers, and let's find one that I haven't yet added. Jumbo prawns. Whoop, there it comes. And on another one. Whoop. Another one. You see how it immediately gives it that class, and then we have that 5 seconds to animate itself in. And then after 5 seconds, it's going to remove all of these classes, and none of these CSS properties are going to be applied to it. So same thing can go for order exit. So we're going to say background thistle. And when the dot order exit active, let's say give it a background of pale goldenrod. And of course we need to, let's just take that transition and put that on there as well. So now when I remove it, it's going to make it thistle, and then remove it. Remove. And then after 5 seconds, it totally removes it. Oh, that's because I need an ampersand here. It's not turning pale goldenrod. So let me try that once more. Animate them on in. And then when I remove them, they start to fade themselves out. Okay, good. Well, what we can do now is sort of the opposite. So the order exit will be translate x 0, start where it is. And then when it's active, translate itself all the way to the right-hand side of a plus 120%. So these should animate themselves in. And then when I click the X, they start to animate themselves on out. It's so cool because everything is just CSS at this point, and we can do some little neat things. So we can say, give it a max height of 0 and a padding of 0 as well. And active, we'll give it a max height of 60 px and a padding of 2 rem 0. And what that's going to do is by giving it a max height, you cannot transition from height auto to height whatever it is. So by doing a max height, it's a bit of a hack that will allow us to transition from one to another. So by adding these, they will start to grow as we have it, as they come in. And then, of course, we can move these transition to 0.5 seconds and 0.5 seconds. And then the transitions are going to be much quicker. But the other thing is that they're not removed until 5 seconds later. So we need to go back into our order and change these enter and exits to 500 milliseconds or 250 milliseconds to get these nice animations. Whoop, I like it. Zoop, zoop. It's not doing it just like my answer. So I think that there's one more thing we need to do here on the padding. In order to overwrite the default padding that I have in my style.css, let's just put some important tags. And then on the exit, we want to do that as well. On the adding, we'll just say padding 0. I think that should take care of it. Beautiful. And then removing, and then removing, and let's get rid of all of these colors here. Everything is nice. Oh, there's still red. There we go. Cool. So the other one is when you want to add multiples. So 8, 9, 10, 11. That's a little bit different because it's not just unmounting and mounting. It's actually replacing a old div. Like right here we have, let's open it up. We have this 19. That's going to be a span, but we are going to add a second. And what's going to happen is we're actually going to have a 19 and a 20, and we're going to animate the 19 up, and then the 20 will animate into its actual spot. So we need to go into our order.js, and we need to start wrapping some of this stuff in some spans so that we have some sort of elements to grab onto. So this count here is going to be on its own line. And we're going to wrap that in a span. Give that a save. See where we're at. Still working. Good. Woo! And then we will wrap everything inside of the li in another span, just because this is how the CSS is working out. So we have a li and we have a span. And then inside of that, we have a span and then the libs and the button. So does that give us what we're looking for? Yes, it does. Okay, and now we need to give ourselves another transition group. So inside of here, we're going to wrap this count here in a transition group. Put the span inside of that. And then we're going to wrap that span itself in a CSS transition component. Now, the CSS transition needs a few options here and also with the transition group. So this is going to be a component. It's going to be a span. And the class name going to be count. And the CSS transition, the class names is going to be count. That's going to be count enter and count enter active, et cetera, et cetera. The key is not going to be a key, but the key is going to be the count. And by doing that, it will tell the CSS transition group to make two separate span elements so that if we're going from 19 to 20, it's going to animate the 20 or the 19 out and the 20 on in. And then the timeout, let's do the same thing we did before, which is we'll say enter is going to be 5,000 milliseconds and exit is going to be 5,000 as well. And then my prettier just took care of some of the formatting there. I should note that what is this double curly brackets here? Well, the first set of curly brackets is to tell React it's JavaScript. And the second is just an object literal. So you could also make a settings object and then up here, say const settings is equal to that. But I'd rather just pass it as an object literal because it's much simpler. All right, nice. Now let's go ahead and inspect just that 6 and click on Pacific Halibut. And you see how it's going to count enter. And so the one of them is entering and the other one is exiting. And then after 5 seconds, it removes all those classes. Let me show you again. Count enter active, and count exit active. So we actually have two different, and if you hit it a couple times, you see that we actually have all of the different spans for 5 seconds. It duplicates them. And then after our timeout that we've specified here, it will actually remove them. So we can go into our animations here and do the same thing. So we'll say .count enter, background red, and transition 5 seconds. And we'll say, and when it has a class of count enter active, background yellow. So then it transitions itself from red to yellow. It doesn't look like it. Oh, count enter active. That should do it. See, it transitions itself from red. It's immediately red, and then it goes to yellow and will move itself on up. So what we want to do with our count enter is we're going to, again, transform it. But in this time, we're going to go on the top to bottom. So we're going to translate Y 100%. So it's going to start, the new one is going to start underneath the 31. It's going to be 32. It's going to start underneath. And then when it is active, it's going to translate itself on up to 0. So let's see what that looks like. Whoop, whoop. You see, every time I add a new one, it will animate itself all the way up And then when it's done, it will remove all of those classes. So that's good. And now we need to take care of the one that's exiting so that you can see that it just moves over right now. That 41 moves over, but we want to do the same thing. We kind of want to overlap it and animate itself all the way up. So let's go. I'm going to say .count exit background black and count exit active background green. Let's make sure that this works. There we go. So it's green. So we want to put a transform by default. Actually, we can just duplicate it. We're going to, by default, we're going to start at 0. And then when it is active, we're going to go to the top, which is negative 100%. It should animate itself vertically. And then we also want a transition of 5 seconds on that one. So is this gonna see? You see the one's leaving as the other one comes up, and then as soon as it's off screen, it removes itself. So again, it moves on up, and the other one comes in. The only problem is that they're not overlapping each other, and that's a pretty quick fix. We put a position absolute in there, left 0, bottom 0, and they should, since this one is absolute and this one is just static, they should overlap each other and animate themselves on up. So there we go. If you do a whole bunch, it sort of gets a little bit crazy, but it still totally works. Animate itself on up. And so you can do some really fun stuff with this where as it leaves, you can scale, I don't know, 3. So the one that's leaving gets much bigger. Woo! Same with this. We could do some other fun stuff or count enter active, or maybe let's go order enter active. So we're transforming it, but we also want to rotate it, I don't know, 1,000 degrees. And then it will, oh, that's not in there. Let's remove a whole bunch of these. And then when I add one, it'll sort of animate itself in. So what's 360 degrees times 4? Let's move it a full amount. And it'll sort of Batman itself on in. It should be Batmaning itself in. I think it's because we should add a rotate 0 to the initial state and then rotate it 1440 degrees when you do have it. So if I get rid of all these, there we go. It sort of Batman's in as we want it. And you can do anything you could possibly want other than just translating the X value. You can change the colors. You can change the font size. You can rotate it any amount that you could possibly want. So I find it is a little bit tricky to get the whole transition group thing up and running. But once you have those classes being added to it, then it's just a CSS issue from there on out. Last thing I wanted to show you is this. Let's go to the top here. We did this twice. We did the same transition group. And then every single time that we change it, see, we already are out of sync here. This one's 500 and this one's 250. So let's change those to 500. And this one also should be 500. And our CSS should also be 0.5 seconds. It's not ideal to have this duplicated twice, because then if you need to update either of them, you need to remember that you update either of them. So we can actually put all of these in just a variable. So let's go right above here where we made the rest of our variables. I'll say const transition options is equal to an object. And then inside of that object, we're just going to convert all of these props to properties on the object. So the class names is going to be order. The key is going to just be the key. And the timeout is going to be just an object. And again, we don't even need the colon key because it's just key. Now we have this transition options, and we can take all of our options out and simply just spread them into that object. And again, we can replace that here as well. And this works very similar to how I showed you with spreading the state. You can just take any object and spread it into a component, and it will apply all of those options to it. So we'll give it a save, and we'll make sure that it actually still works. Remove them, still works beautifully. Add items to our order, and it works beautifully. If I ever need to make an option change, I just need to pop this in here. And that's kind of neat, because if you even wanted to put this in a separate file because you were using this specific transition in many components, that would be totally easy. You just export it from that file, import it into this file, and you're going to be in good shape.